All right, so what lessons can we learn from this ancient myth, the Tower of Babel? And I will say the first thing is, don't worry, there's a deeper meaning than in trying to figure out at the most superficial level. People have said this is the story that explains why there's languages in the world, but it's actually much deeper than it. In our tradition, if you go to the deeper meaning, which we'll get into today, it actually is quite practical for our lives and the world that we live in today. So let's get into it. This is actually one of my favorite Old Testament myths. In fact, I find it extremely relevant in the work that I do. And famous painting is in my apartment because I think about this quite a bit. So if you've been following our series, we can go to the next slide on the Old Testament. You'll see a similar theme that's emerging. God helps a new group of people get on the right path, and slowly they bend toward evil, and they define the meaning of life as looking out for their own interests without the concern for others. So this is a continual pattern throughout humanity. God sets people out, lets them have a free life, and then there has to be some sort of intercession to keep people from just becoming, destroying themselves and others. And so that's really what the story of Babel is about. Next slide, please. Today, the Tower of Babel, as you will see, is another warning to humanity, moving toward a time when people did love one another, and they moved away from that to a desire to control, dominate, and destroy others. So it's often seen as a story about why we speak different languages, but when we look at the deeper meaning in our tradition, there's so much more. It really tells the story of human evolution and gives us concrete lessons for a world in crisis. Next slide, please. So as I do on these stories each week, just a quick summary of the story. There's a group of people. They move to a plain called Shinar. It's very specific, and they move eastward. And if you go to the next slide, please. Everybody in the world at that time, it says, spoke the same language when they get there. Next slide, please. And they begin building a city, and they decide to build a tower so high that it will reach heaven. And they believe this is going to give them a great reputation, and they fear being scattered. Next slide, please. And there's an odd mentioning of something. It says they used bricks instead of stones. They used tar instead of mortar to build it. Next slide. And then, according to the story, God thwarts them by giving different languages, and this makes it so they have inability to build the tower, and they're scattered all over the earth, and the tower is stopped. And that is just a quick summary of it. So what are the lessons of the Tower of Babel, and what do the symbols mean? So I'm going to go through the symbols right now, then we'll get to some lessons. So that first part about the plain called Shinar and moving east is symbolic of when humanity was moving away from God. So that's what the symbols are. So humanity was once a very, people were all living lives of love, and they were moving away from this life of love of each other. Next slide, please. And they spoke the same language. And the symbolism of this is that at that time, there were diverse religions all over the world, but all of them taught the importance of loving the neighbor. So that every single religion in the world at that time taught the importance of love and understood that's what it was, even though there were diverse religions. Next slide. So then there's this mention of the fear of being scattered. And the deeper meaning of that is that they moved from loving one another to wanting to seek control of one another. And more specifically, as we'll see, they wanted to use religion as a means to control other people. Next slide, please. So then they built the tower. And this is symbolically representative of when people use, leaders particularly, use ideologies to control other people for evil. And it's most common, particularly in the ancient world, through religions, but it exists in ideologies in more modern times. So what they do is they twist religion to serve the purpose of controlling people. And so that tower, building a tower, represents a desire for power over others. And then there's another odd mention of they build bricks instead of stone. What that means, stones are symbolic of natural truths, but bricks are manufactured, they're created. And they, instead of using mortar, which is much stronger, they use tar. So the symbolic meaning of that is that they begin developing ideologies that serve their own purposes, and they twist religion, using religious language and using religions, but it's in an effort to control people, not to love one another. Next slide. So the different languages that come up in the story represent that as they develop this lack of love for one another, they develop selfish love, and they all began caring only about themselves. And then there was disputes, confusion and divisions that had not existed before. And this is interesting. So in that confusion, God steps in. And so this is an interesting, I think, concept here, that in each of the cases where humanity gets spiraling down into very dangerous levels of evil and there's no freedom, God intercedes in some way to allow people back to freedom again. So in this story, he stops their creation of a tower, and he stops the growth of spirituality and religion being used to control people. Okay, so those are the symbolic, deeper interpretations of what the text means. What does that have to do with us today? What is the spiritual psychology lessons for us today of this ancient myth? Primarily, it's a warning to all of us to be very wary of our ideologies. And that means an ideology is how you view the world, and we can get very wedded to how we view the world. This is most particularly dangerous when it's done, as we'll see, with religion, because religion speaks to the highest meaning of people. People respect religious leaders, and they often infuse religious dogma into personal ends that are destructive. So the most dangerous ideologies, as I'm mentioning, have been religious ones. And this last week, I was meeting with a friend who is Afghani, and his family was leaders in the Pashtuns. And the Pashtuns were against the Taliban, if you remember. There are many other tribes. But one thing that he said that really stuck with me, and I think is very appropriate for this message, he said what the Taliban did very successfully was they took nationalism and they married it to religious fundamentalism. And that was a very toxic but very powerful mix. So anybody who was kind of angry about nationalism became attracted to it. And even though they may have not been open to the law, and he said eventually it took over Afghanistan. Sadly, the person who was telling me the story, his father was assassinated because he was a Pashtun leader fighting against the Taliban. Ideologies blind us to others. We can't see the good in people. And this slide here, you'll see that something I've mentioned in the Cain and Abel sermon is that Christianity has a long history of marrying up Christianity with false ideology that controls people. So when Christians conquered foreign countries, very often they killed people who didn't submit, and did this all in the name of God. We are saving you. So that is a perverted ideology when people are killing people in order to save them. So the slave trade would be a good example. Below are pictures of parents who are showing photographs of their priests. Very often, religious leaders have incredible power over people. Be very wary of religious leaders, because if they're using fear or manipulation to get you to do anything, get away. But it's very common throughout history. We saw it recently within the churches. And then on the right, of course, it wasn't too long ago that if you had the wrong Christian belief, you were killed at the stake. So religion and ideology. If we can just hold it right there for 1 second. Ideologies blind us to other people. We can't see the other people that we disagree with as good. We begin to simplify things, and we begin to decrease our own humility, and it leaves us without goodwill for people who are different than us. And it leads to an antagonism and a bitterness. And we quote, if you've heard the expression, other people, we dehumanize others. We can be aware of this in our own lives when we say things like, I wish those idiots over there would be just like me. I wish I could just dominate them and control them. Even when we get into that, we are participating in this very dangerous path. So when we hear a voice in our head that moves us in a way that we kind of like, I'd like to punch them, I hate them, that we are giving, we're participating in Babel. That is, we're bringing evil into ourselves. We have to be extremely aware of it. It all starts with individuals, but leaders throughout history, particularly religious leaders, have tapped into that energy, and it's very dangerous. So as we build our own towers of domination over others' ideology, we don't just disagree. We really do we come to hate them. And, this friend of mine who was from Afghanistan said, what he's noticing in the United States, he said, it's no longer just good enough to hate people you disagree with. You hate people who talk to people that you hate. So it's a whole different thing. And if you're a peacemaker, if you're trying to do dialogue, now you're hated as a sellout to your tribe. Now, this is very dangerous, and this is very much taking place in our own country right now, where we're using ideology to justify a desire to cancel people, destroy people, and we feel a certain sense of joy when bad things happen to them. I noticed during the COVID crisis, people who didn't take the vaccine or didn't wear masks or whatever, when they died, there was almost a little bit of like glee, like, you moron. I guess you're going to learn somehow. But being happy about a person's death is another sign that we've gotten into a mentality of good versus evil. We're on the good side. Or another way it plays out is a victim versus a villain. And we see ourselves as victim, and there's the villain, and we've got to be on the side. So this is very, very powerful energy taking place today. This is happening very much in the United States today. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in the United States today, we're seeing this. This is our capital, and during the insurrection that took place on January 6th, one thing that I noticed as a minister was the number of crosses, photo images of Jesus, posters that said Jesus saves, that were used to smash into the Capitol. Next slide, please. Here, people are carrying the cross to the Capitol and praying as they're engaging in violence and hatred toward others. So this is what's called Christian nationalism, and it is very similar to what my friend from Afghanistan was saying. It's when you marry up, yes, I'm a nationalist, I love the United States, I'm patriotic, we're the best, okay, and I married up to a religion that says this is God's country, we can do no wrong, we're blessed, God is on our side. Very toxic and dangerous combination that we need to be aware of, particularly as Christians. Next slide. So this last week, this is troops in Israel taking the bodies of people who were killed, is a very clear sign of what's going on, the horror, when you combine religion and nationalism. And that's what Hamas has done. And in the case of many of these murders that took place of Israelis, the killers screamed, "God is great," as they committed atrocities. This is a live example of this very dangerous, toxic combination of fundamentalism. I know my God, and I know I'm on the side that's saved, and my nation. And as we know in the Christian faith, Jesus does not align to any nation. Christianity does not align to any country. It's much bigger than that. So anytime someone says that our country and then marries it to a religious thing, we need to be very careful of it. Next slide, please. This is a picture of me. I did do a tour of the Middle East and got to see. It's one of the saddest things is that the most holy land, where the monotheistic Abrahamic religions shares common, is the most violent, and it's a lot to do. There's a very powerful. I mentioned Hamas. I met with the PLO. You can see me there coming out of the PLO in the West Bank. But there's been a strong rise in fundamentalist Judaism, using language like we have to destroy, crush, and kill every Palestinian. So again, nationalism and fundamentalism, very deadly combination. They feed each other. And the worst part is they don't care. The more that the violence increases, the more of a spiritual warrior they can be, willing to die because they believe that they're on God's side. So I will just also say that, just to get a flavor of it, on my trip to Israel in 2017 with the National Council of Churches, I went to Hebron, and we went to Israel, we went to Palestinian areas, we went to Egypt. But we went to Hebron, and this is what I wrote in the newsletter for the Messenger, our national denomination, and for our church at the time. Hebron itself was a ghost town. The streets were patrolled with checkpoints. There was deep sadness. 600 Israeli settlers, mostly fundamentalists, had built very modern settlements illegally overlooking this ancient city. And they literally threw their trash down the streets of Hebron. And this is where the Palestinians live. So there was literally a net over the street and to catch the trash. So the disdain and the humiliation that was being done, and it was mainly by the ultra-Orthodox who were claiming it. So you can see fundamentalist religion married to nationalist is a very toxic and dangerous combination, and one we need to be aware of. So I've mentioned the United States. It is very much behind what is taking place in the Middle East. Next slide, please. So we have to be aware of ideological leaders. Even groups like Black Lives Matter, we find out that the funds raised from that campaign, NPR reports that they bought $6 million homes from the finances from that. Gurus are very, new age gurus. It's not unusual to see a guru sexually abusing people within the group. Again, they are using the power of their religious titles. And of course, we have a whole prosperity gospel in the United States where very wealthy pastors are bilking very poor people and living in they're literally hundreds of millions of dollars that they make. And so we just have to be extremely, extremely aware. It's not just Christianity, Judaism, Islam. It's any ideological group that tells you we're on the side of good, they're on evil, we're the victim, they're the villain, and it justifies behavior. So we have to be aware of it in all of its various guises. Next, please. And one of the worst examples this last week that I saw is that extremists thrive on extremists. And just that this is at the Sydney Opera House where pro-Palestinian rally for Hamas was screaming "gas the Jews." So this is the very, very toxic mix. When you put your ideology and religion together, and it's something we should all be extremely careful of any leader in our political life, in our spiritual life, even ministers who tell you, you are going to go to hell if you don't show up, you're going to go to hell if you don't give more money. These sort of things are that toxic combination, and you should be aware of it and you should move away from it. Next slide, please. Eventually, that ideological hatred leads to destruction and the collapsing of the Tower of Babel. Next slide, please. So what lessons can we learn, particularly now in this crisis that we're in right now? One, just be aware of ideologies that seek power by dehumanizing others, often religious, saved, unsaved, animals, any language, rats, idiots, morons. When you see, if your side starts using that, be very aware of it. It's very dangerous. So it starts with dehumanization, and it's seeking to control for their own selfish gain. It's not for the good of the people. Second thing is to be aware of simplistic victim versus villain thinking. The world is extremely complex. Please allow for nuance. But we generally love to get to binaries, and we very much in our minds want to solve any issue that we hear by declaring the one side is the victim and one side is the villain, good versus evil. We're on the side of good, and it kind of justifies whatever we have to do. It's a very dangerous set of things. So I would allow for complexity in your life. Right now, as you're watching the situation in the Middle East, to the extent that you need to take time off, I highly recommend it. I'm not good at that. I tend to watch everything, but I will say, try to watch something from a perspective that's different from the one that you're on, or you're going to get amped up in your own perspective. And the social media has contributed to that. And that really leads me to the third lesson. Become aware of your own blind spots toward other viewpoints that you dislike. Just entertain the thought of what it would be like to see the world through their eyes. Why do they view it? They're children of God. They're trying to figure it out. How did this happen? Try to see it through there. I know that in a time when we're in a crisis like we are right now, there's so much pain, and pain generally wants to be defense, and then also it can lead to the next thing, revenge. And revenge leads to a vicious cycle that you really just want vengeance. And beware of that in our own life. I've certainly felt it in my life. Oh, good. I see that they're failed. I see they failed. Oh, good. I want revenge. Be careful of that energy in ourselves. And I think these lessons from Babel are very appropriate for this week. Having no idea when we picked the topic, right, that this would be what's going on. But you will be asked to be repeatedly by groups on social media to see the victimization of their side and the villainization of the other side, and that simplicity. And one of the most complicated things for us to realize is we are all victims and we are all villains. We are all good and evil working within us. Next slide. So what can we do? So I believe as followers of Jesus, we're called to be peacemakers. I know sometimes that sounds naive. People sometimes tell me I'm naive when I say this. I firmly believe it. We must not give in to despair. We must be people who hold hope. I believe Church of the Holy City is called to play a peacemaker role in this world. I've been doing this training this last year, and on cultural translation to see different viewpoints. That all started with a sermon at Church of the Holy City, where we, on the Tower of Babel text many years ago, and I did my first presentation at our convention. And over the last few months, sadly, I've been working with Israeli groups before all this happened. And now they tell me it's lost for the moment. I don't believe that. I think there can be a chance. I understand the pain. I understand the anger. But, and then this last Friday, a group introduced to me through Katerina, a Ukrainian group, met here with me at the church. Meeting with this gentleman that I met with this last week from Afghanistan. His father was assassinated, but he wants to be a peace person for Afghanistan. And then that photograph that at the last slide was here through Annabelle's work, looking at potentially partnering with South Korea as a church. I think these are all places that we can be involved in our tiny little Washington, D.C. Church of the Holy City. Do not underestimate the power of God when you embrace peacemaking. And I ask all of us to just resist the temptation to fall into hatred of each side, and let us be beacons of hope. And understand there are people who are very affected by this that are not going to be, you're not going to have a reasonable conversation. That's okay. People have to be in that period, and you can just be there with them, let them know you love them. But we, I think, need to not fall victim to that. And we don't want to fall victim to any group who uses this crisis for domination and control of people. And that really is the Tower of Babel. So I do believe that all of us are called to become translators. at this Tower of Babel. And I challenge all of us this week and in these weeks ahead, let's commit ourselves to the challenge, despite how naive it might sound, to find ways for peace and find ways to dialogue and find ways to rehumanize people, because the forces at work are just going to amp each other up, and we have to be a different force for good in the world. Amen.